Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? Do you care anymore? Or I care how you're doing. I don't know whether you care, but take some time out to care about how you're doing. It is Tuesday, June 30th, the end of June. It's been a long June 2020. It's been a long couple of months of everything. And of course, still in the middle of a global pandemic, not that you would know it from the level of activity to combat it going on in the White House or anywhere, and really at almost any level of government at this point. But much to cover. Like I said, just as we noted yesterday, just your typical, I guess now Tuesday rather than a Monday weekend roundup, a little bit of treason, a little bit of pandemic, a little bit of civil unrest, you know, the sorts of things you're normally used to waking up to in the morning. Daily Co's Radio is live now. We are reminded all the way from Portland, Maine, thanks to Bill, who tells you really that you should be tuning in to hear me, Kagro X, David Waldman, say, the president dropped his phone into the toilet at his Bedminster Golf Club 272 times, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. It might work. And you know what? At this point in our history, I think we should be working on upgrading the T-shirts. Really, honestly, at the minimum, if you get a hold of a good T-shirt these days, a good, really solidly well-made, 100% cotton, let's say, T-shirt, no matter really what's on it, it's a good thing to get a hold of. At the minimum, you can, of course, cut it up and make your own masks out of it. So it's not for nothing that you get these T-shirts. I don't know whether it's enough to get off of the lousy talking point. But, well, there you have it. Let's see. Everybody spending their time today probably going over casualty lists, trying to figure out whether the people who are service members killed in Afghanistan may or may not have been the targets of bounties paid by the Russians. I guess the White House is still sort of in denial mode, but they'll have to come up with new angles on the denial since, they did such a bad job with it last time and yesterday and through the weekend. All their stories are falling apart. And I don't know. All the stuff's connected at this point. Let's see. Yesterday's news on all of this was that they were still maintaining that the president hadn't been briefed. Now people are parsing what does it mean to say that the president has been briefed. Apparently some of this hinges on being able to say that that unless you were given an oral briefing where presenters come from the intelligence services and talk at you, then this doesn't count as a briefing. That putting it in a written product doesn't count as briefing the president. Now, that might be true in this administration, that putting something in a written product means it won't be read, and it's just not going to happen. And you can't say you briefed the president if you wrote it down and gave it to him. But they do have this problem. Also, part of the news, apparently some of the intelligence community sources and White House connected sources are telling everybody that, they have specific dates in mind in which if you were to look at the PDBs, you would find out that he was, in fact, informed of the bounties. And they're being very specific, and I see the date of February 27th being floated all over the place. But there's a problem with that as well. But I guess right around late February is when they're saying they last put it in the PDB. Now, the other problem with it, of course, the story of the president wasn't briefed or written products don't count as briefs, is that the PDB, as we understand it, stands for President's Daily Briefing, or Daily Brief anyway. And it's awfully hard to get away with the excuse that something that was in the daily brief wasn't briefed to you, but, it's crazy times, and that's where we stand. All right, so let's see. One of the other breaking news stories of yesterday was that February 27th or thereabouts was not, in fact, the first time that the White House was made aware of the fact that the how will we say it? The fact that the intelligence services say that they had credible intelligence leading them to believe, giving everybody every possible benefit of the doubt, that the Russians were paying bounties on the deaths for the killings of American troops in Afghanistan. And who knows whether it was beyond Afghanistan, for that matter, but apparently that's where they had the arrangement most nearly finalized, to where they were actually making payments. And so now everybody's going back and tracking all the deaths, but apparently back as early as March, possibly April, but I think now they're saying March 2019, they were aware of this. And that covers an awful lot of time that Trump spent sucking up to Putin, because no puppet, you're the puppet, et cetera, et cetera. People pointing out every time that he came to the defense of Putin or declared his interest in inviting Russia back to what was then the G7, but he wanted to expand again to the G8, and making all sorts of excuses for why we ought to be having a good relationship, as he viewed it, with Russia, by doing their bidding and jumping out of their way about everything, and even facilitating their agenda in Ukraine. Well, that'll probably upset some people. Of course, another reflection on it that's more recent, I did see, was it Steve Vladeck commenting today about how bad Trump's June actually was. Let's see, he had said, Trump's June, he summarized this way: started by forcibly dispersing peaceful protesters so he could take a picture. You, of course, remember the clearing of Lafayette Square Park so that he could cross the street and have his photo taken outside of St. John's. And it ends with a scandal in which the best spin is that he ignores his intelligence briefings. In between, not only did he do nothing to abate a pandemic, he admitted he pushed to slow testing. Yeah, so actually is a pretty bad June when you think about it. And it would be troubling for, pretty much anybody. But I guess if you're a Republican, I don't know, somehow it's great. And today, mark your calendars, it'll be easy to remember. June's not over yet. June 30th was the day that we found out that Republican office holders actually think that paying bounties to kill American troops is a good thing. And we'll wait for the explanation as to why that's the case. It will follow soon enough. But I assure you, the president is authorized by the Constitution to do this. And anyway, it's really actually good for us, for the economy, for something. And, we'll all learn that we were pretty wrong on this, just as we have been with everything that comes before the Supreme Court. Okay. Well, anyway, I just thought that was a good encapsulation of it. Although I did think that there was an extra level of irony that we could note for you on that, and that is that, again, Trump's June started by forcibly dispersing peaceful protesters so he could take that picture, and ends with that scandal, as he says, in which the best spin is that he ignores intelligence briefings. But what that means is June started with Trump summoning the military to Washington, D.C. to help him feel safer while he cocooned in the basement bunker during the Black Lives Matter protests. And, we all remember how that went. And, the military, not that keen on doing it. There was some pushback on whether or not the whole thing was legal or at least advisable. And he demanded that states mobilize their National Guards, both here and around the country. They brought in troops from all over the place. The old guard was put on mobilization notice to show up in D.C. and perform what used to be the ceremonial duty of protecting the president, but now actually armed and combat ready to protect the president. But relying on the military to save his skin, and then by the end of the month, we found out that he knew all along that the Russians were paying bounties to murder those troops if they were dispatched to Afghanistan. And probably if they could find them anywhere in the world, they would have been perfectly happy to dispatch them then. but I don't know if it would have been bounty worthy. It does make you wonder whether at any point Trump did ask questions about the bounties, and that the question wasn't, can anybody get in on this, or do you have to be an Afghan fighter, or can I maybe arrange this? Don Jr. loves hunting, and he loves going to exotic locales. He could always use a little extra cash. Maybe they looked into it. Maybe they didn't. I don't really know. But that it was, I thought, an extra irony that when he was scared, when he was shaking and hiding in the bunker, he called on the U.S. military unnecessarily, obviously, but he called on American troops to come to his aid personally, because everything is personal with him. And by the end of the month, we found out that he was selling their lives to the Russians. Now, one other angle on this that I keep mentioning on Twitter, I think I may have discussed it a little bit yesterday, and we're causing some confusion. There's some pushback, some people who don't believe in the theory of the fungibility of all money, and sometimes you can stretch that theory to the breaking point. It's possible. But we have heard in the middle of all this, and we really need to sit down and read through some of these articles, that the bribes, the bounties were in fact paid in U.S. currency, that for some reason still around the world is the currency people want to be paid in for almost anything, but certainly for illegal things, because we're just not very good at tracking it, I guess. And but the bounties were paid in U.S. dollars, which by itself doesn't necessarily mean that there was anything nefarious going on the part of the United States in order to facilitate these payments. But you should recall how much reporting there's been, some more speculative than others. Did I construct that sentence wrong? Doesn't matter. Anyway, the point is, we've all been talking for a long time about the extraordinarily strong likelihood that Trump Organization businesses have facilitated a great deal of Russia's money laundering. And when I say Russia, I guess these days it's very hard to separate, if it's ever been possible to separate Russia's government from the illegal personal, or I guess the personal illegal activities of the various oligarchs who move in and out of, or work in close proximity to the Russian government. And it's a very blurry line between the two. But all money being fungible, basically, if Putin is arranging for the payment of these bounties, even if he's having an official government entity make the payments, there's very little reason to differentiate, and very few ways that would be acceptable accounting to differentiate between particularly the secret services and secret police and intelligence services of the Russian government and the private business interests of the oligarchs it serves. So almost regardless of who's making the actual payments, it'll be very difficult forensically to differentiate between money they generated elsewhere and money that was laundered for them by the Trump Organization. Millions of dollars, billions of dollars perhaps, have moved through Trump-owned and Trump-connected properties and businesses and cleaned up dirty Russian money, which, once returned to the control of the Russians, at least some of that ended up funding an operation like this one. And it's awfully ironic, let's say, that all of that hard work in laundering the money for Vladimir Putin is paid back this way, except, we know who the dominant one in the relationship is here. And there's I'm sure there's some amount of this that is probably going on as a power play for Putin himself, saying, I think it really caps things off nicely here to play Trump this hard and then also damage him in ways that would be so thoroughly embarrassing and destructive of his political presidency that I can hardly resist. I must embarrass this guy even further. So, all right, maybe we dive into some of the articles here. Oh, yes, right. There was also one aspect of Bill's opening tweet for us that we haven't discussed quite yet, but I guess we can dive into that too. I don't know if I have articles on this one, but yesterday's other mini controversy was the White House's Monday explanation of how it took so long over the weekend to get the president to, I guess we'll call it correct, even though he really didn't do, but quote unquote correct the, I don't know what, the poor judgment of having retweeted the video from the Villages in which the one of the many elderly white supporters of Donald Trump was caught on video shouting out "White Power, White Power." I guess you know what? People were joking yesterday. The only person that didn't hear the guy say "White Power" is the White House, and I guess all the Republican senators. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't hear it. I also didn't hear it. I never actually played that video with the sound up. I never had to, and of course everybody told me what was going on, and I have no reason to doubt you. But at any rate, having tweeted that thing out, there was some question from the press about, well, one, why did he do it? And two, once they got the president to delete it from his timeline, the question was, why did it take so long? And the answer they're going with on this one is that the president was golfing, and that, which is a bad answer to begin with. And that to top it off, they said the president was golfing and had put his phone down and was therefore unreachable for this period of about 3 hours or so before they could get a hold of him, explain the situation, and get him to agree to take the post down. I don't know whether the stories describe how much time passed between getting hold of him on the phone and getting him to agree to take the post down, whether that was a relatively quick turnaround or whether they spent an hour convincing him that it was wrong to be retweeting somebody screaming "White Power." But that's probably answered in the articles. I guess the more interesting facet of it to me, of course, is, I think to a lot of us. One, the idea that the president is unreachable while he's playing golf. Like, hey, I said this morning on Twitter, if there's a nuclear war breaks out while the president's golfing, well, we're just going to have to lose that war because you can't get a hold of the president, and everybody knows that. But don't worry about it. It's only happened 72 times during his presidency's first 3.5 years so far. So not a really big deal. Well, about every 4 days or so, the president is incommunicado for 3 to 4 hours, and whatever happens, happens. And then, of course, was it Asparagus Zucchini pointed out, well, look, no one wins in nuclear war. There's no winners in a nuclear war. And that's generally held to be true, chiefly, I think, based on the old doctrine of mutually assured destruction. However, I think it's still arguable, even if one side doesn't respond in any way to a nuclear attack because the president is golfing or asleep or whatever they might be doing, or on the take from the other side in the nuclear war, whatever it is that's driving it. It's probably still the case, arguably, that even a one-sided nuclear war doesn't have a winner. Of course, I guess it has a pretty clear loser, at least for the first 15 minutes or so. And then, of course, I guess if it's a full-scale nuclear attack, the fallout and effects of it probably end up engulfing the entire globe. And, well, really, there were no winners. A lot of initial advantage in casualties early, perhaps, but eventually, you might argue, the Russians would catch up in casualties during the following nuclear winter. But who knows? Maybe they attack us with low-yield nuclear weapons and we don't respond. And then you could, I don't know, do you really want to spend this much time trying to figure out whether it's winnable? I think he makes a good point. But that's kind of where we stand with this, that the rest of the world now knows that the president, well, they don't really know that he's unreachable because, of course, the reality is that was a huge lie there's no sense in which the president is unreachable while he's on the golf course. He might not want to be reached, and it'll make people, he'll make him mad at people, and he might fire them if you bother him while he plays golf. But, of course, he's reachable. There was also the good point somebody made yesterday on Twitter, like, the president puts his phone down, like, just leave. Is it possible that the president of the United States, with God knows what information and phone numbers on his phone, could leave that in the bathroom somewhere, and somebody else could just pick it up and be like, I wonder what I can do with all this information? Or is it not really like that, and he didn't really put the phone down or whatever? But plus, of course, the ridiculousness of of saying that this enormous motorcade that the president travels with wherever he goes, including to play golf, and you see it every time he takes off for a golf outing. I mean, it's it's a good dozen vehicles in the caravan carrying all those diseased people from the various places that he's traveled to out to idyllic and low infection relative to D.C. and some of the places that Trump has visited, Loudoun County, Virginia, just to play around and infect our population. But the caravan full of cars, and apparently none of those people carry cell phones, or there's no phones in the cars, and the whole myth of the president being followed around by the nuclear football so that he's in contact at all times and can respond to global emergencies at the drop of a hat. What kind of hat, I suppose, makes a difference these days. But apparently that's all out the window with this presidency. Except it's not. It's just a stupid, venal, useless, pointless lie that I assume will have fallen apart by the time we get to our first commercial break. But there you have it. The word is that he is unreachable while he's on the golf course. He's unreachable while at the desk. If you give him a written product, and if you give him an oral product, don't have enough pictures and say his name enough, then you're not going to capture his attention either. But really, honestly, who needs it? All right. So good morning. How you doing? Hope all is well with you. What should be the next story? Should it be the story breaking this morning that Kellyanne Conway's daughter, that's how she's described in the tweets that I saw about this, not as Kellyanne and George Conway's daughter. So it's possible that she's just Kellyanne's daughter, and she was either married before, or I don't know what her history was, or she had her daughter with someone other than George, but I don't know. Maybe they just forgot that George was married there. I don't know. Anyway, her daughter is an anti-Trump TikTok teen, or so we are supposed to believe. I guess with this family, it could mean anything. I mean, George is anti-Trump, so even if George is her stepfather, I think it would probably make it makes a certain amount of sense that she too would be anti-Trump. But she seems to be a little more clearly liberal anti-Trump, because I haven't heard very much from George Conway. Well, we don't know, but we haven't heard a whole lot of George Conway's opinions on Black Lives Matter and other things that might indicate a closer affinity with liberal causes than just anti-Trumpism. But anyway, she's apparently a TikTok teen, and the timing lines up. And I guess somebody discovered her TikTok account, and it's very entertaining. And it would be funny if all of that was true. But that's also not really tops of the charts in terms of the stories for the day. There are a lot. We'll run through a couple of the other things, and maybe we'll get back to them. Maybe we won't. We won't have time to start reading the articles until our second segment. Other news, this one comes to me by way of Zeynep Tufekci's Twitter feed. She's sending out this LA Times article to illustrate the point. Los Angeles, she says, with an exclamation point, and here the quote from the article. According to data by Foursquare, and again, it is amazing that in this day and age we're getting all our best epidemiological information from our phone apps. But it makes sense. According to data by Foursquare, that weekend, what is this? I guess it's, pardon me. sort of a weird, out of context thing, but I'll just read it as it's stated here. According to data by Foursquare, that the weekend, we found out now, maybe according to data by Foursquare, that the weekend after June 20th, the day when bars reopened in Los Angeles County, 500,000 people visited nightlife spots. And that's probably not even a big crowd, but it's a big crowd for a pandemic. But 500,000 people visited nightlife spots, and the county has observed a 40% increase in coronavirus cases among younger people. So kind of a direct correlation, most likely. Although who knows what the average age of the barflies in LA County is. We don't know that for sure, but it's a pretty strong assumption. I'll go with it. Perhaps we can read that article and find out more about that. But yes, more emerging news about, yeah, you can get coronavirus if you're younger. And yeah, it can actually have some serious effects on you as well. Another piece of coronavirus news that I happened upon yesterday from KOMO, one of the TV news stations out in the Seattle area, if I have that right. At least the Dateline is from Seattle. King County, which is where Seattle is, right, is ramping up its contact tracing team as a key component to the state's path forward. And what a super component it is. Health officials say the tracers are finding most people are waiting too long to go into isolation, saying only 21% of the people they contacted went into isolation on the day they first developed symptoms. More than half are waiting until they get tested, which, again, is really too late for our purposes here. On average, there's a 3-day gap between the time symptoms develop and when a person gets tested. So in other words, people who are symptomatic and suspect that they may in fact be infected are going out about their business among the rest of us and possibly infecting the rest of us while they decide whether or not to get a test and then while they wait for the results. That's not the way it works. As soon as you feel like you're sick, you really need to remove yourself from circulation. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday. But our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. All right, welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Okay, let's see. We got plenty to cover here. What were we talking about when we left off? I can hardly even remember now. But yes, right. About not isolating when you find out that you are sick. I have more to say about this, but I would like to move on from this. We'll do that in just a second. But not too much more to the KOMO article here to share with you. With a quote here from Seattle King County Public Health Department's Dr. Matthew Golden, saying, look, this is what we're asking of the public. If you develop a symptom, it is critical that you test right away and that you go directly into isolation. Right now, the county has 28 contact tracers whose job is to track down anyone who has had close contact with an infected person. More than a dozen team members will begin training in the next few weeks. That's good news. Unfortunately, we probably should have ramped up on that much earlier. But you know how we are about ramps in this country since President Trump encountered his trouble with it at West Point, which actually just leads us to the opportunity to observe once again that, yes, Donald Trump went all the way up to West Point and endangered everybody, by the way, and forced the graduating cadets to self-isolate as well, to spend 2 weeks in quarantine waiting for him to come up, presumably so that they didn't infect each other and the president when he came to speak at their graduation. But apparently he spent some time afterwards complaining about how arduous it was to salute all of them as they graduated from West Point. I never really thought of that as an arduous task, but I suppose it could take its toll on you, especially if you were maybe an older person and it's very hot outside, or the ramp is like an ice rink or whatever. But that did also coincide rather closely with our finding out about those bounties being paid, and I just thought it was kind of interesting. I made a little rhyme out of it over the weekend, right? That Trump goes to West Point to salute him, and then Putin gets to pay to shoot him, or something like that. I can't remember. Came out with much better meter, I think, on Twitter when we did it the first time. But yeah, imagine that. Imagine knowing that you are about to be busted on, I mean, you had to imagine you'll eventually be busted on, knowing that there were bounties being paid on these soldiers' lives, and then up to West Point to salute them and pretend you're the best buddy, and God love you, I'll be so great at the military your head will spin. Well, heads are spinning. Anyway, yes, that was a sidetrack from the story that we were concluding from Seattle, that people just aren't paying attention to how this pandemic works and what the protocols are around this pandemic. And it occurred to me, I mean, this is why we do lockdowns. I know everyone was complaining about the lockdowns, or 15% of the country was really complaining about the lockdowns, and that got translated into everyone, and I just made the same mistake. Most people were not complaining about the lockdowns. So they had their complaints about it, but it wasn't the lockdown that they opposed. But we do lockdowns. It's a new thing for us. But the reason that we were confronted with that option, and not, say, the Swedish model, which hasn't been a success by most measures anyway, but people proposed, well, you can trust Americans. There's still American states working on this model where they say, we do need to have masks and people do need to socially distance and we do need to have these businesses closed, but I'm a Republican governor and I'm afraid to issue those orders because I'll be protested. I'll be seen as being anti-Trump as well, and that's supposedly a weakness, which they really haven't figured out that it's actually probably pretty good for you. It might be your best bet when facing re-election to say, I defied Trump's dumbest stuff, at the very least. But that's the situation we're in. And the reason we do lockdowns is because people don't, as a rule and as a whole, people don't do very well with following instructions. Actually, that's a poor way of putting it. On the whole, people do a pretty good job. It's just that there are so many of us and so many weird circumstances out there that the net result is that plenty more than enough people to ruin it for everybody somehow fail to follow the instructions. There are so many people out there, if you instruct everybody perfectly, and 1 in 100 just goofs it up or has some strange, extenuating circumstance that makes it impossible for them to comply, or just don't understand or think they understand, but they understand it incorrectly. Like the family we were reading about the other day. Oh, we did all the social distancing except for the party that we had. And I didn't go to the party except for when I went to the party. And yeah, all of that. Well, here we have people, they've been telling you since the beginning, since the wash your hands thing, since the, don't wear a mask because we need to save them for medical workers. Since those days, they've been saying, if you have symptoms, and here are the symptoms, isolate, assume you have it. When tests become more readily available, you can, of course, go and get a test. For a while, it was impossible to get a test. But the point was, you were supposed to isolate from the beginning. And apparently that's only sunk in with 20% of the people in one of the original hotspots in the country, by the way, in the Seattle area. And I don't know. I don't really understand why people have not gotten that, but I guess people think, if I'm going to have to, I don't know what people are doing. If I have to self-isolate for 2 weeks, then I better get some food. I got to go shopping so that I can isolate. Well, at that point, the real way to handle it, I guess, is you're supposed to just go straight into isolation, send someone else to do the shopping, use one of the shopping services. I know that for some percentage of the people, that's going to be an impossibility, and there are extenuating circumstances all over the place, but where there aren't, then just follow the advice, man. It's gonna help a great deal. But that's where we are, and like I said, that's why we have lockdowns instead of, we'll just give people good information and instruct them what to do, because they won't do it. Just like we were given the mask information. A lot of people have complaints about the original mask advice. And if now you want everybody wearing masks, the first couple of weeks you were saying don't wear masks. And it wasn't because they weren't saying don't wear masks. They were saying don't go out and hoard the available supply of disposable medical masks, not even the N95 masks, but even the disposable surgical masks. They loosened up on that a little bit later, but those masks were needed for in and around the hospital where they were, in enclosed spaces and working with sick patients of all kinds and vulnerable patients of all kinds. They needed those masks for the medical workers because we were unprepared for this emergency with the stockpile of them. And so they said, we don't want people running out and grabbing up all the masks. Now, mind you, they did that anyway. And it only took a few days, really, before people said, a mask would be a good idea and you should make your own. But if you gave that out as nuanced advice, it wouldn't work. They didn't even bother giving that advice out. But they thought probably, look, it'll be executed better on the whole if we tell people don't bother with the masks, go home, stay home, leave the masks for the professionals, and eventually when production catches up or we're able to source other masks or people will learn to make cloth masks on their own, then you will all be asked to mask. And it was pretty clear. I think we understood it here early on. It wasn't hard to explain, but that's where we are in the country, and that's why we haven't been able to control this pandemic. If you're sick, stay home. Can't do it. If you are, if you encounter medical grade masks, leave them. Just again, go home and leave the masks for the professionals who need them. But couldn't execute on either of those things. And, this is just a great example of why. The fact that you could be feeling sick and saying, just a couple more days in circulation, coughing on people, and then I'll get tested, and then I'll wait for the results. And when it says the results are in, and I definitely have it, then I'll think about one or two last shopping trips before I self-isolate. Doesn't work that way, and that's why we have, what are we up to, 2.5 million plus cases. I'll check in on the Worldometers and figure that out. Worldometers, of course, very interesting because it has, real-ish time count of all these things, including all of these calculations of how many cases we have per 1 million in population. And, it keeps a real-time tracker of the estimates of population as well, watching the population rise and fall in more or less real time. We have some news on that front. The population of the United States of America has fallen by at least one, apparently. We need to announce the passing of Carl Reiner, comedy legend, as most would have it, and I think that's probably pretty true for all of us. And if you are somehow unaware of his accomplishments and take some time to make yourself aware of how many of the comedy classics he's been involved in, although I'm sure the TikTok teens would say, I never heard of any of these things. You'd just be wrong. But anyway, yeah, Carl Reiner, 1,004 years old, apparently. He's 98. It's a very long life, and it seemed longer probably because of his involvement with Mel Brooks, who was also 1 million years old, and their production of the classic comedy bit, The 2,000-Year-Old Man. And basically, the thing is, for 100 years or so, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks have had a shtick, and you know that word probably largely because of their work, but they've had a comedy, they've made their comedy lives on pretending that they're considerably older than they are. It's always been an old man thing, or has been for the last 400 years. So it just seems like he's 200 years old, but he's really only 100, or a little less than 100. Okay. Well, that's pretty amazing all by itself. And take some time to review the body of his work, and you'll be happy at the end too. And if you've actually somehow never heard of Carl Reiner or the work that he did, well, I can't say you've been, well educated, I guess. But you'll find. Well, who knows? Maybe it's all generational, and you won't find it very funny. But a lot of other people did, and that's important. And it's really interesting, the group that he was with, and how long lived, how long they've been alive. They're very old people, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, great loss, and active to the end, and that's the way to do it. All right, let's see. Now checking in with the ways not to do it, no matter what it is like Donald Trump does. There's a million other stories to catch up on here. Oh, one other quick hit here I noticed from the Hill. AMC theaters have pushed their reopening plans back by 2 weeks, which is always good news. AMC, of course, that chain that announced a couple of days ago that when they did reopen, they would not be requiring masks in their theaters. And that just made it seem like they were going to be death traps, because they are. And now you have to wait 2 more weeks than you thought you had to if your plan was to die in an AMC theater. And there are so many ways to die in their theaters, too. This one that we're talking about currently, of course, you presumably would die elsewhere unless you're an avid moviegoer and you were back for another screening of another movie to watch while you died eventually 2 to 6 weeks later of coronavirus. But there are faster ways to die at AMC's theaters, of course, and probably. Well, I wonder if that factored into it at all. Where maybe are they scared of allowing people to come in masks because they're afraid that another crazed mass shooter will come in with a mask? It's the gun you got to worry about, not the masks, of course. But presumably they would have been against the idea of allowing masks in their theaters in the time in between the various theater shootings that we had and the pandemic, and all of us would have been on their side for that one too. No, you can't walk into theaters masked. Everybody's on edge as it is with all the mass shootings, but things have changed since then. All right, let's see other stories to cover here. Let's see. Getting back to Trump and his craziness. Let's see. I'll share this. Is this leading me to the article I want? That must be part of it. Yeah, I had mentioned to you that because we now are hearing that the White House, whether that means Trump or anyone else or everyone else, was aware of the Russian bounties since early 2019. I happened across the tweet from Jesse Lee saying, yeah, Trump spent the entire G7 summit in August of 2019, after all this was known, advocating for Russia to be readmitted. And of course, just recently, now that the United States is set to host the G7 meeting, which has been postponed at least due to coronavirus fears among the rest of the world. And not here. We're not afraid of it. We just all know we're going to get it. But he's been saying for the last couple of weeks that he intended to have the Russians attend, even if the rest of the G7 wouldn't have them as a member of the group. Anyway, Jesse saying he spent the entire G7 summit in August of 2019, after all this was known, advocating for Russia to be readmitted. It caused a total meltdown with America's oldest and deepest alliances. And he links to an article here. Trump advocates for Putin at G7 summit in move to soften Russia's pariah status. That described the atmosphere there, and is a post article from the period, August 27th, 2019. And Russia's pariah status among the others of the G7. Now, by rights, they should have had pariah status here in the United States, and they did for the most part among American people, but not with our president because reasons known and unknown. But Jesse's tweet does bring up a good point, and I guess it's also a good segue to some of the other stories. It wasn't the story that he was linking to, but he might as well have linked to this story from CNN, which you no doubt heard something about yesterday as well, by the other ancient Carl in our lives, Carl Bernstein. He's not that ancient, and whatever, but it was an opportunity there, and I took it. The CNN piece, From Pandering to Putin to Abusing Allies and Ignoring His Own Advisors, Trump's Phone Calls Alarm U.S. Officials. And again, most of the basic information here is something that's been known to us for some time, that Trump, when he's on the phone with foreign leaders, is at best overly solicitous of a-hole dictators from around the world, and at the same time, horribly abusive to our closest allies. And as it turns out, to no one's surprise, he's most abusive to those allied leaders to those allies whose heads of state or political heads are women, including Theresa May when she was Prime Minister of the UK, and Angela Merkel, who's still Chancellor of Germany, despite all the abuse that she took from Donald Trump and probably from her own domestic political rivals. But hey, who's counting? But this is really interesting. We've known about this for a long time. We know, for instance, that there was the reports that he was horribly abusive to the Australian Prime Minister. We know about how slavish he is with Turkey's Erdogan and with Putin. But this had some real punches in it. And of course now I guess it's they're starting to name names about who in the White House, who formerly in the White House, has thought this or has had these thoughts about Trump. And now, as Twitter friend, I think it was Unstable Isotope who was pointing this out. Yeah, now we know why the White House was so dead set against any testimony being taken from witnesses during the impeachment hearings. They might have stumbled across assessments like these. And these opening paragraphs really kind of sum up, well, really the whole show since Donald Trump has been president. In hundreds of highly classified phone calls with foreign heads of state, and that kind of statement immediately makes me wonder whether this is what Trump had in mind when he was insisting the other day that any conversation with me as president, any conversation with me is classified. I think just this crazy overreach, but I think the idea of it, which was we would fight anybody, we would bog them down in the legal system for as long as possible, anybody who sought to take any sort of testimony or evidence based on someone else's recollection of a conversation with me. You can't tell anybody what you think I said to you, because the fact that I said it means it's classified and will sue you for, or pursue criminal charges against you, perhaps, for violating the national security. Ironically, of all these things, he's going to sue other people for violating national security, for revealing how much of a threat to the national security he is. And that's what comes out in these first couple paragraphs here. If I can just read them to you. Why don't I just start? In hundreds of highly classified phone calls, yes, with foreign heads of state, President Donald Trump was so consistently unprepared for discussion of serious issues, so often outplayed in his conversations with powerful leaders like Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Erdogan, and so abusive to leaders of America's principal allies, that the calls helped convince some senior U.S. officials, including his former secretaries of state and defense, that and two national security advisors and his longest-serving chief of staff, that the president himself posed a danger to the national security of the United States, according to White House and intelligence officials intimately familiar with the contents of the conversations. This is such an intense opening statement here that I was distracted about 15 times in reading it. And the most pointless observation, let's make that one first. That was one sentence. That's pretty incredible. In hundreds of highly classified phone calls with foreign heads of state, comma, President Donald Trump was so consistently unprepared for discussion of serious issues, comma, so often outplayed in his conversations with powerful leaders like Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Erdogan, comma, and so abusive to leaders of America's principal allies, comma, that the calls helped convince some senior U.S. officials, including his former secretaries of state and defense, comma, 2 national security advisors and his longest-serving chief of staff, that the president, they convinced them all that the president himself posed a danger to the national security of the United States. I would say period here, but no, comma, according to White House and intelligence officials intimately familiar with the contents of the conversations, period, at last. It's amazing. Not just for the grammar, syntax, and punctuation. The calls caused former top Trump deputies, ready for some M-dashes, including National Security Advisors H.R. McMaster and John Bolton, neither of whom we have a great deal of respect for, but there it is. Defense Secretary James Mattis, also kind of an idiot, but all right. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, all a bunch of losers, of course, according to both Trump and, I'll have to agree with them. They really are. As well as other intelligence officials, led them all to conclude that the president was often, quote, delusional, as 2 sources put it, in his dealings with foreign leaders. But, the upshot of all this, of course, is what did they do about it? And the answer is one of them wrote a book, and the others have waited until it's too effing late to do anything to say so. But there you have it. He's delusional in his dealings with foreign leaders. The sources said that there was little evidence that the president became more skillful or competent in the telephone conversations with most heads of state over time. Rather, he continued to believe that he could either charm, jawbone, or bully almost any foreign leader into capitulating to his will, and often pursued goals more attuned to his own agenda than what many of his senior advisors considered the national interest. So, hello, we need you to do us a favor, though. I need you to talk to me about Burisma and Hunter Biden and do all of that before we take care of any of the matters of state before us, right? These officials' concerns about the calls, and particularly Trump's deference to Putin, take on new resonance with reports the president may have learned in March, and now we learn in March of last year, that Russia had offered the Taliban bounties to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan and yet took no action. CNN sources said there were calls between Putin and Trump about Trump's desire to end the American military presence in Afghanistan, but they mentioned no discussion of the supposed Taliban bounties. And I guess if you wanted to offer any kind of defense, and you shouldn't, not only should you not offer it, you shouldn't want to offer it, but you could imagine something, and I imagine this will be spin presented at some point today. You could imagine a spin that goes something like, well, I guess you could go anything from realpolitik to nihilism. On the realpolitik side, you could say, well, what if the president did, in fact, intend to, for our own reasons, withdraw all forces from Afghanistan, and was hopeful that that negotiations then ongoing would result in a satisfactory solution whereby he would order the withdrawal of American troops at long last. But he felt that dealing with the issue of the bounties or taking some sort of retaliation would blow up those discussions, and even more American soldiers would end up dying in Afghanistan because we were staying longer. I mean, you could make that play, but of course now it's too late to make that play. They've painted themselves into this corner of we didn't know, we were never briefed, we did know, but it didn't matter, whatever. So that I think is lost to them, not that it will stop them from trying to make that play if they perceive a chance of convincing even some part of their base that it was true. But there's also you could possibly have gone with just the nihilistic explanation of, well, what were you really going to do? I mean, because I've been thinking about it. What would I advise a president to do if they found this out? And the answer is something, but what would be that thing? In the absence of a good answer, I guess you could come to understand initial paralysis for some short period of time, but a 1 year period of time is a lot more difficult to understand. Plus, of course, during the entirety of this time, he's still remains so solicitous of Putin that it's hard to believe that he entertained any other thoughts. It's hard to believe that he entertains any thoughts at all. Again, let's continue just before our break, get another one of these one-sentence paragraphs in. By far the greatest number of Trump's telephone discussions with an individual head of state were with Erdogan, actually, who sometimes phoned the White House at least twice a week and was put through directly to the president on standing orders from Trump, according to the sources. Meanwhile, the president regularly bullied and demeaned the leaders of America's principal allies, especially two women, telling Prime Minister Theresa May of the United Kingdom she was weak and lacked courage, and telling German Chancellor Angela Merkel that she was, quote, stupid, which is an amazing thing, of course, for Donald Trump to think of anybody, but to think it of Angela Merkel, yeah, well, that's stupid. I mean, for lack of a better word, but this one was just hanging right there. By the way, I think at some point in the near future in this article, it is noted that, just to tie it back to something we discussed earlier, it's noted that President Erdogan of Turkey not only phoned Trump all the time and was to be put through directly to the president on standing orders of the president, but that he was successful in reaching Donald Trump at one point on his cell phone while Donald Trump was, you'll never believe it, at the golf course. Which is amazing, not just because he's always at the golf course, but because you'll remember right up earlier in the show, we were talking about how the White House was hanging its hat on his unreachability when he's at the golf course. But not for him. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Boy, okay, let's see. Did I capture all the things that I saw fly by on Twitter during that break? And no, I missed one, and I got to scroll back because there were some good items. Not that I believe that there's ever going to be time to get to them, but okay, there's the other one. Let me just get these at least pocketed for discussion tomorrow if we can't get to it today. Let's continue on with the stories of the Trump phone calls because it's just so unbelievable. And, you know, Carl Bernstein does a great job at writing this all up in 4 sentences, apparently. The whole thing, the entire article fits in those. Okay, the full detailed picture drawn by CNN's source. Did I skip something yet? Yes, I skipped down to look and see if I could find the report of how he reached him on the golf course. We'll get to that. Trump incessantly boasted to his fellow heads of state, including Saudi Arabia's autocratic royal heir Mohammed bin Salman, Mr. Bowen saw, and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, about his own wealth, genius, quote, great accomplishments as president, and the, quote, idiocy of his Oval Office predecessors, according to the sources. So a lot of eye rolling and a lot of strain, I guess, on the ocular muscles on the part of the foreign counterparts with whom he conversed, apparently. In his conversations with both Putin and Erdogan, Trump took special delight in trashing former presidents George W. Bush, I would like that, and Barack Obama, and suggested that dealing directly with him, Trump, would be far more fruitful than during previous administrations. That's an awkward construction that suggests that dealing with him during his administration would be more fruitful than dealing with him before his administration, which was just flatly true. Well, I don't know. I guess now that he has the power to do things and everything Trump touches dies, maybe it wouldn't be more fruitful. But okay, that's not the point of the sentence. Now, this is interesting. Even Trump doesn't even know how to curse properly. You remember? I guess this is evocative of what was it? I went after her what was it? I can't remember how he said it. But went after her like a bitch or something. When he was talking about you remember the whole pussy grabbing instant, or the discussion of it anyway. And yeah, that he said these things. It was like, where are you learning your locker room slang, man? You don't know how this stuff works. Listen to this. So, this is apparently part of the conversation of Trump grousing about Bush and Obama to the foreign leaders. And this is the quote. "They didn't know BS," he said of Bush and Obama, one of several derisive tropes the sources said he favored when discussing his predecessors with the Turkish and Russian leaders. They didn't know BS. Now, I've heard people say they didn't know use the S word. They didn't know crap. But I've never heard anybody say they didn't know BS. Like, that would be a good thing, right? BS we think of as, well, we know what BS is, but right, it's something you don't want people to do. They didn't know BS. Like, they didn't know how to BS people, but I do. Again, he screws up even his cursing out old, predecessor presidents. He can't get right. Anyway, just reminds me of that whole line. And now I got to go look that up, what the line was about the something like a bitch was like. Is this just an excuse to use the word bitch? I didn't make any sense. He's such an old fuddy-duddy idiot. But that's the least of our problems. Remember also, he's unreachable in case of a nuclear war. And he paints his face orange, and, he thinks windmills cause cancer. I could go through the litany here. But the full detailed picture, there we are, drawn by CNN sources of Trump's phone calls with foreign leaders, is consistent with the basic tenor and some substantive elements of a limited number of calls described by former National Security Advisor John Bolton in his stupid book, the name of which is here in print. But the calls described to CNN cover a far longer period than Bolton's tenure, are much more comprehensive and seemingly more damning in their sweep. A lot of M-dashes in this piece. Loves the M-dashes. Like Bolton, CNN's sources said that the president seemed to continually conflate his own personal interests, especially for purposes of re-election and revenge against perceived critics and political enemies, with the national interest. Who would have predicted that he would conflate his own interests with the national interest, except everyone who's been watching him forever and was predicting it since before he assumed office. To protect the anonymity of those describing the calls for this report, CNN will not reveal their job titles nor quote them at length directly. More than a dozen officials either listened to the president's phone calls in real time or were provided detailed summaries and rough text recording printouts of the calls soon after their completion, CNN sources said. The sources were interviewed by CNN repeatedly over a 4-month period extending into June. And what a June it's been. The sources did cite some instances in which they said Trump acted responsibly and in the national interest during telephone discussions with some foreign leaders. That they actually have to note. CNN reached out to Kelly, McMaster, and Tillerson for comment and received no response as of Monday afternoon. Mattis did not comment. The White House did not respond to a request for comment before the story published. After publication, White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews said, quote, "President Trump is a world-class negotiator who has consistently furthered America's interests on the world stage. From negotiating the Phase 1 China deal," whatever that was, I know it was like a trade deal, but no one remembers it, and the USMCA, that was the renamed NAFTA, right, to NATO allies contributing more and defeating ISIS, President Trump has shown his ability to advance America's strategic interests. That's the quote. One person familiar with almost all the conversations with the leaders of Russia, Turkey, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe described the calls cumulatively as, quote, abominations, unquote, so grievous to the U.S. national security interests that if members of Congress heard from witnesses to the actual conversations or read the texts and contemporaneous notes, even many senior Republican members would no longer be able to retain confidence in the president. So I guess that's why they weren't allowed to hear them. It would be embarrassing for you to hear those things, have everybody watch you hear those things, and then vote against impeaching him or vote to acquit him in the Senate, depending on where you served. The insidious effect of the conversations comes from Trump's tone, his raging outbursts at allies while fawning over authoritarian strongmen, his ignorance of history and lack of preparation, as much as it does from the troubling substance, according to the sources. While in office, then Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats expressed worry to subordinates that Trump's telephone discussions were undermining the coherent conduct of foreign relations and American objectives around the globe, one of CNN's sources said. And in recent weeks, former Chief of Staff Kelly has mentioned the damaging impact of the president's calls on U.S. national security to several individuals in private. Two sources compared many of the president's conversations with foreign leaders to Trump's recent press, quote, briefings, scare quotes, right, on the coronavirus pandemic. Free-form, fact-deficient, stream-of-consciousness ramblings, full of fantasy and off-the-wall pronouncements based on his intuitions, guesswork, the opinions of Fox News TV hosts, and social media misinformation. In addition to Merkel and May, the sources said, Trump regularly bullied and disparaged other leaders of the Western Alliance during his phone conversations, including French President Emmanuel Macron, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. In the same hostile and aggressive way, he discussed the coronavirus with some of America's governors. Remember, you're all weak, and I'm in the bunker and telling you you're all weak, and you got to dominate, right? Next to Erdogan, no foreign leader initiated more calls with Trump than Macron, the sources said, with the French president often trying to convince Trump to change course on environmental and security policy matters, including climate change and the U.S. withdrawal from the Iranian multilateral nuclear accord. Macron usually got nowhere on substantive matters, while Trump became irritated at the French president's stream of requests and subjected him to self-serving harangues and lectures that were described by one source as personalized verbal, quote, whippings, especially about France and other countries not meeting NATO spending targets, their liberal immigration policies, or their trade imbalances with the U.S. But his most vicious attacks, said the sources, were aimed at the women heads of state. In conversations with both May and Merkel, the president demeaned and denigrated them in diatribes described as, quote, near sadistic by one of the sources and confirmed by others. And here's another quote. Some of the things he said to Angela Merkel were just unbelievable. He called her stupid and accused her of being in the pocket of the Russians. Gee whiz. Who's stupid and in the pocket of Russians? Well, projection much? Sure, of course. He's toughest in the phone calls with those he looks at as weaklings and is weakest with the ones he ought to be tough with. So what a man. Perfect for the job. Tough on the weak, or people he thinks of as weak, and weak with the tough. These calls, quote, are so unusual, unquote, confirmed a German official, that special measures were taken in Berlin to ensure that the contents remained secret. That's the really one of the more outrageous aspects of all this. Not outrageous, but just amazing. And if you sit down and think about it, you can figure out why. It was America's role in the world prior to the Trump administration, anyway, was so critical, and I guess they're still stuck in that thinking, and I guess they have to be. It's so central to the functioning of the world order that it is a risk to Germany's national security to let anybody find out what they know from personal experience about the deficiencies of character of Donald Trump. because America's central to the order that we've established for the post-war world since World War II. And that all collapses if you find out. They must be crossing their fingers. Can we make it to 4 years without letting everyone know that there's no Western alliance to speak of anymore that includes the United States? They're just out of it. And all the things for which the world has assumed they can count on the United States up to now, we just obviously can't. Now, I guess at this point, maybe they're letting this stuff leak now because they're like, well, the pandemic has laid it all bare. There's no longer any point in keeping up the charade. It's obvious that America's leadership days are either over for good or at least are effectively over while Trump remains in office. Really, while Trump remains alive, basically. But he's ruined everything. And the pandemic, here's where, the politics, the geopolitics of the bounties and the trade screamings and rantings and the various other diatribes against world leaders overlaps with the pandemic. I think I'll posit to you that history will show that the pandemic laid it bare, that there was, we keep saying there's no hiding from the pandemic, there's no hiding from the virus, there's no hiding from the science, and yet we watch them continue to hide from the virus and the science. So what does that even mean? And I guess here's where it really comes home to roost, right? It's clear that the Germans, well, it will be clear once I read this to you anyway, felt that it was in their interests and possibly the interests of other allies as well, but certainly in their own interest, to help cover up the fact that Trump was so was going to come up so immeasurably short on the requirements of the job that it would endanger German national security. And now this is leaking out because there's no point in hiding it anymore, I guess. Anyway, the calls are so unusual that even in Berlin, they took measures to ensure that their contents remained secret. The official described Trump's behavior with Merkel in the calls as, quote, very aggressive, and that's a nice way of putting it, and said that the circle of German officials involved in monitoring Merkel's calls with Trump has shrunk. It's just a small circle of people who are involved, and the main reason, is that they are indeed problematic. They need to have fewer people in Germany knowing what Trump says, because the more people in Germany find out what Trump says to Angela Merkel, the worse off Germany and the rest of the world is. Trump's conversations with May, the UK Prime Minister from 2016 to 2019, were described as humiliating and bullying, with Trump attacking her as, quote, a fool and spineless in her approach to Brexit, NATO, and immigration matters. He'd get agitated about something with Theresa May, and he'd get nasty with her on the phone call, one source said. It's the same interaction in every setting, coronavirus or Brexit, with just no filter applied. Merkel remained calm and outwardly unruffled in the face of Trump's attacks, like water off a duck's back, in the words of one source, and she regularly countered his bluster with recitations of fact. The German official quoted above said that during Merkel's visit to the White House 2 years ago, Trump displayed, quote, very questionable behavior, unquote, that, quote, was quite aggressive. The chancellor stayed calm, and that's what she does on the phone. And that's unquote there. So two different approaches taken here. You'll see about what May does. But Merkel, clearly, I don't know whether that's her nature normally. But again, just to protect the national interest in Germany and their Western allies, I guess that's normalizing in a way, but they just figured that's the lesser of two evils, Let everyone know that the Western alliance has collapsed entirely and just let their guard down, show their hand, or pretend and see if you can hold on for 4 years. Prime Minister May, in contrast, became flustered and nervous in her conversations with the president, even though he relied on her to keep him from slipping and falling down the stairs that one time. Nice of him to return a favor. He clearly intimidated her and meant to. said one of CNN's sources. In response to a request for comment about Trump's behavior in calls with May, the UK's Downing Street referred CNN to its website because they didn't want to answer. The site lists brief descriptions of the content of some calls and avoids any mention of tone or tension. The French embassy in Washington declined to comment, while the Russian and Turkish embassies did not respond to requests for comment. The calls with Putin and Erdogan were particularly egregious in terms of Trump almost never being prepared substantively and thus leaving him susceptible to being taken advantage of in various ways, according to sources, in part because those conversations, as with most heads of state, were almost certainly recorded by the security services and other agencies of their countries. In his phone exchanges with Putin, the sources said, the president talked mostly about himself, frequently in over-the-top, self-aggrandizing terms, touting his unprecedented success in building the U.S. economy, asserting in derisive language how much smarter and stronger he is than, quote, the imbeciles and, quote, weaklings who came before him in the presidency, especially Obama, reveling in his experience running the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow, because that's such a great experience, and obsequiously courting Putin's admiration and approval. You might remember, by the way, that Putin was invited to attend the Miss Universe pageant and blew him off because that's how important he thought Trump really was. Putin, quote, just outplays him, said a high-level administration official, comparing the Russian leader to a chess grandmaster and Trump to an occasional player of checkers. Weak analogy, but okay, we all get it. While Putin destabilizes the West, said this source, the president of the United States, quote, sits there and thinks he can build himself up enough as a businessman and tough guy that Putin will respect him. And it says here, parenthetically, at times the Putin-Trump conversation sounded like, quote, two guys in a steam bath, a source added. Not sure what to make of that one, but okay. I think I get the picture. In numerous calls with Putin that were described to CNN, Trump left top national security aides and his chief of staff flabbergasted, less because of specific concessions he made than because of his manner, inordinately solicitous of Putin's admiration and seemingly seeking his approval, while usually ignoring substantive policy expertise and important matters on the standing bilateral agenda, including human rights and an arms control agreement, which never got dealt with in a way that advanced shared Russian and American goals that both Putin and Trump professed to favor, CNN sources said. Throughout his presidency, Trump has touted the theme of America First as his North Star in foreign policy, advancing the view that America's allies and adversaries have taken economic advantage of U.S. goodwill and trade, and that America's closest allies need to increase their share of collective defense spending. He frequently justifies his seeming deference to Putin by arguing that Russia is a major world player and that it is in the United States' interest to have a constructive and friendly relationship, requiring a reset with Moscow through his personal dialogue with Putin. He does say that, and he does make that argument, and a lot of people do buy into it, but it is interesting. As I read this yesterday and now reread it, I recall how often we've thought that Trump's brain really basically froze in the 80s and possibly the early 90s, and he's sort of stuck in this mode of thinking about Russia, that Russia is in fact a major player, when I think a more objective look at it, as described later on here in this article, would tell you, yeah, they're not the Soviet Union anymore, and they're a major adversary for us, but it's not. They're not a superpower in the same respect. But Trump never really evolved to that current level of appreciation for what they really are in the loose sense, right? In separate interviews, two high-level administration officials familiar with most of the Trump-Putin calls said the president naively elevated Russia, a second-rate totalitarian state with less than 4% of the world's GDP, and its authoritarian leader almost to parity with the United States, and its president by undermining the tougher, more realistic view of Russia expressed by the U.S. Congress, American intelligence agencies, and the long-standing post-war policy consensus of the U.S. and its European allies. He, that is Trump, gives away the advantage that was hard-won in the Cold War, said one of the officials, in part by giving Putin and Russia a legitimacy they never had, the official said. That's actually a very good point. He's given Russia a lifeline because there is no doubt that they're a declining power. He's playing with something that he doesn't understand, and he's giving them power that they would use aggressively. And it's a good point. Just to reiterate, both officials cited Trump's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria, a move that benefited Turkey as well as Russia, as perhaps the most grievous example. He gave away the store, one of them said. The frequency of the calls with Erdogan, in which the Turkish president continually pressed Trump for policy concessions and other favors, he knows what to do on those calls, was especially worrisome to McMaster, Bolton, and Kelly. The more so because of the ease with which Erdogan bypassed normal National Security Council protocols and procedures to reach the president, said two of the sources. Here's the story. Erdogan became so adept at knowing when to reach the president directly that some White House aides became convinced, and this is probably true, that Turkey's security services in Washington were using Trump's schedule and whereabouts to provide Erdogan with information about when the president would be available for a call. On some occasions, Erdogan reached him on the golf course, and Trump would delay play while the two spoke at length. And that's maybe actually a fairly responsible thing to do, right? A world leader calls you and you're playing golf, delay the golf. I won't argue with that, but yeah, not hard to believe that basically, hey, look, have the Turkish embassy in Washington call us when they find out on Twitter that he's going to play golf. He's got a, half an hour in the car, not to mention 4 hours out on the golf course. I'll reach him then, and then I'll just talk him into whatever I want. And it works. Two sources said, wait a minute a second. Let's see. Yes, all right. Two sources described the president as woefully uninformed about the history of the Syrian conflict. That's not hard to believe. And the Middle East generally. Jared, you do it. And said he was often caught off guard and lacked sufficient knowledge to engage on equal terms in nuanced policy discussion with Erdogan. Erdogan took him to the cleaners, said one of the sources. The sources said that deleterious U.S. policy decisions on Syria, including the president's directive to pull U.S. forces out of the country, which then allowed Turkey to attack Kurds who had helped the U.S. fight ISIS and weakened NATO's role in the conflict, were directly linked to Erdogan's ability to get his way with Trump on the phone calls. Trump occasionally became angry at Erdogan, sometimes because of demands that Turkey be granted preferential trade status, and because the Turkish leader would not release an imprisoned American evangelical pastor, Andrew Brunson, accused of, quote, aiding terrorism in the 2016 coup that attempted to overthrow Erdogan. Brunson was eventually released in October of 2018. Despite the lack of advance notice for many of Erdogan's calls, full sets of contemporaneous notes from designated note takers at the White House exist, as well as rough voice-generated computer texts of the conversations, the sources said. According to one high-level source, there are also existing summaries and conversation readouts of the president's discussions with Erdogan that might reinforce Bolton's allegations against Trump in the so-called Halkbank case, involving a major Turkish bank with suspected ties to Erdogan and his family. That source said the matter was raised in more than one telephone conversation between Erdogan and Trump. Bolton wrote in his book that in December of 2018, at Erdogan's urging, Trump offered to interfere in an investigation by then U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Jeffrey Berman, into the Turkish bank, which was accused of violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. He just out and out offered, I'll interfere for you. Trump then told Erdogan he would take care of things, explaining that the Southern District prosecutors were not his people, but were Obama's people, a problem that would be fixed when they were replaced by his people, Bolton wrote. Berman's office eventually brought an indictment against the bank in October of 2019 for fraud, money laundering, ding ding, and other offenses related to participation in a multi-billion-dollar scheme to evade the U.S. sanctions on Iran. On June 20th, Trump fired Berman, whose office is also investigating Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, after the prosecutor refused to resign at Attorney General William Barr's direction. Unlike Bolton, CNN sources did not assert or suggest specifically that Trump's calls with Erdogan might have been grounds for impeachment because of possible evidence of unlawful conduct by the president. Rather, they characterized Trump's calls with the heads of state in the aggregate as evidence of Trump's general unfitness for the presidency on grounds of temperament and incompetence, an assertion Bolton made as well in an interview to promote his book with ABC News last week. Quote, "I don't think he's fit for office. I don't think he has the competence to carry out the job," Bolton said. Well, there's a little bit left here as we enter our last segment, but our last segment, of course, will be reserved for Joan McCarter's call, but I'll bet she'll want to talk a little bit about this, but maybe we'll change subjects just a little bit. It's been a long time on this, but this was an important article, and it was here, and it's easy to read, and it was outraging me all over again, giving me energy, giving me life for the radio show. We'll be right back after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Joan McCarter is with us. She called in during the break. We're all updated on treason and pandemic and various other things. And we've learned that no news from the Supreme Court so far today. Everybody's on major decision watch, but I guess they're waiting until the last possible second or something.
I guess so. They're definitely going into July now with decisions. We know that for sure.
I guess so, because that's tomorrow.
Because that's tomorrow. Can you believe tomorrow is July?
Yeah, it seems like just yesterday that I closed the front door and never left again.
Yeah.
It was March when I did that. And yeah. Time's sort of slipping away in pandemic lockdown. Not for everybody. Some people are going to bars and reigniting the pandemic in Los Angeles and elsewhere. But okay, not so much for us, thankfully. Well, let's see. So no news from the Supreme Court, but we're still waiting on some major decisions.
Well, they did actually release. Look, they're not big opinions today. Right. An 8-1 opinion from Justice Ginsburg in a patent and trademark case.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
5-4 Montana's exclusion of religious schools from state scholarship funded by tax credits violates federal constitution.
Okay.
Dissents from Ginsburg, Breyer, and Sotomayor, so we don't like that decision clearly, but those are the only two today.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, if I was having trouble following the sentence, but you're saying excluding what was it? The scholarships, excluding scholarships from private religious schools?
Tax credits to private religious schools in Montana. Let me look again.
Just curious.
Montana excluding religious schools from a state scholarship program that is funded by tax credits.
Yeah,
violates the federal constitution.
Really, that seems so unclear to me.
I don't see how.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the case is probably brought because people thought, well, if anything, the Constitution would say that we shouldn't use taxpayer dollars to pay for scholarships. I guess it's for people to attend private religious schools because separation of church and state. And while I could see coming down with the decision, don't worry about it. That doesn't really violate the separation of church and state. It's not unconstitutional to do it. coming to the decision that it is unconstitutional to separate that money seems like, well, you might have taken things further. I'll have to read the decision, but
Yeah. Just
doesn't seem like
on
it
the
makes
basis
sense.
of the SCOTUS blog tweet, I don't have enough information.
yeah, it's not your fault.
Yeah, does that? Yeah.
That seems odd, but whatever. I don't know what to say. Yeah, that another of the big stories of the day that we haven't gotten to yet, and we don't have to spend time with it. I'm sure you've got some thoughts, but I will mention that news from the newsroom at the Washington Post that they talked. We talked about Carl Bernstein's piece. We're still reading it over at CNN. Meanwhile, Bob Woodward dissuaded from releasing a story that would have established quite clearly, apparently, that Brett Kavanaugh was just completely lying out his ass at the various of his hearings for confirmations for judicial positions.
Yeah, we knew that. And he lied to the Post, which is an interesting thing. The story was spiked by the Post, although he had lied to the Post. It went back to the Starr investigation into Bill Clinton, which Kavanaugh was, of course, one of the lawyers on.
Right.
He was a busy little guy.
He did everything. Forrest Gump
Brooks Brothers rioting
evil.
and Ken Starr investigation. Anyway, he was a source for Woodward in his stories, or in his book, rather, about that impeachment process. And he had written to a letter to the Washington Post vehemently denying, Kavanaugh had, that he had been a source. And Woodward said, well, yeah, no, you're a source.
Yeah.
And during the Supreme Court nomination process, Woodward wrote a story about this.
Yeah. You're lying.
That, Kavanaugh's lying to us. He's lied to you before. He's lying now. He's a big fat liar. And the Washington Post spiked the story.
Yeah. Interesting. The whole thing has been kind of fascinating. And I can see why they did it. Although, I have my doubts about their, overall reasoning. But yeah, they were saying, it's part of our job. You protect your sources. He was a confidential source, and we used him as a confidential source. And now that it won't suit our agenda, we can't really just say, to hell with our agreement to keep his having been a source, a confidential bit of information. We'll just report it. But
on the other hand, here was a clearly problematic lifetime appointee to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like I get the point about the keeping confidentiality with your sources, but there aren't a whole lot of lifetime appointments to top government positions, and it seems like maybe the lifetime appointment thing screws everything up, throws all the balances out of whack when you're trying to come up with an ethical solution to something like this. And I guess there's also the argument, well, I'm not going to say what he was a source on necessarily, or which quotes are to be attributed to him. He can maintain his anonymity in that sense, but for him to deny that he was a source when he was is a new issue.
Yeah.
He's a liar, and he'll
and
lie.
An extremely pertinent issue when at that point his lies to the Senate were kind of a feature.
Yeah, right.
It may have even been pre-Blasey Ford before we heard about those allegations. It might have been still when we were focused on the part about how he was perjuring himself, if that's what it is when you lie to the Senate.
Yeah.
It would have been a pertinent story, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, too bad about that. We find out about all these things with some frequency. We find out that the newspapers say, don't tell anybody about that until it's too late. Like, warrantless surveillance, and keep that until after the 2004 election.
That can wait until after the election.
Yeah. Or let's confirm him to a lifetime appointment. It's more than an election. It's something that for the most part, cannot be undone. Ever. We'll address it later. Maybe. Or maybe not.
Or maybe not.
Yeah.
We may get one gift out of Kavanaugh, and that might be getting rid of Susan Collins.
Okay. Well, that would be helpful. I don't see how she lives any of this down, although she's trying very hard.
She's 0 for 3 with Kavanaugh right now.
Yeah.
Dreamers, LGBTQ, employment, and abortion. She's 0 for 3 on her boy.
At least they're not major issues affecting anybody, right?
Right. That, she's
kind of like
staking her moderate Republican reputation on.
Yeah, well, we all knew that was done. It's amazing that there is even still anybody pretending to be a moderate Republican, and that you would be able to do that. I guess that's just a testament to the length of a senatorial term. I guess you just don't get very many chances to get rid of someone like that. But I guess she's the last pretender at northeastern New England old line moderate republicanism.
I guess so. Did you see her response yesterday to Kavanaugh's vote on the Louisiana abortion case?
Briefly, but I will need a refresher. How about if you provide that?
Well, it wasn't about Roe v. Wade. Okay. He's still not going to overturn Roe v. Wade, so I'm fine with my vote for him, because this wasn't Roe v. Wade.
Okay. I mean, yeah, sure. Whatever.
Come on, Susan.
But, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I thought that perhaps, maybe she now reduces her support for abortion rights solely to Roe v. Wade. That was the last correctly decided abortion decision there was. Everything else afterwards I disagree with, but as long as that one stands.
Right. Never mind that it's completely gutted thanks to these decisions, but hey.
Yeah. Like at this point telling everybody you're a huge fan of the Voting Rights Act. Well, it's been gutted. Or I love the Affordable Care Act, even if the individual mandate is gone and the rest of it has been attacked, and now the whole thing will be invalidated as a result, partly of my own vote.
Yes.
But
because I think we know where Kavanaugh's going to come down on that one.
Yes. No
but after yesterday's decision in Louisiana, I think we also know where Roberts is going to come down on that one.
Yeah. Well, I guess. Right? I just are we talking about his? Every once in a while, he discovers, oh my God, they're gonna kill us all. They're gonna destroy the Supreme Court and hang us if we don't just not do. I know this is what we were sent here to do, but less so for me than for you two guys. Gorsuch occasionally you can do something different. Kavanaugh's never gonna.
That's the other possibility on the ACA case, because it is such a specious, ridiculous challenge that Gorsuch might just be too, what's the word, Gorsuchy?
I guess so. Yeah.
to say to go along with. It might be too ridiculous for him. To agree to.
He's the kind, apparently, at least the last decision gave us some inkling that Roberts, to some extent, also, I guess, even to a greater extent, are two guys who say, I liked going to law school. I enjoyed learning the intricacies of the law and how it works and what our system is like. And I uphold the values that it's all supposed to be based on. Whereas Kavanaugh, you get the idea, he was such... You know what he was like as a student? He was probably like, I don't know, I guess I'll go to law school because I'm not ready to get any real jobs.
Right.
And then was like, I guess I'll be a lawyer. Mostly they're pretty rich, and I'm, connected. I can get one of those good jobs where you don't really have to know what you're talking about and make a lot of money. So, or at least get myself taken care of for a lifetime, even if he never made enough money to, say, cover his baseball debts or country club memberships. But
somebody took care of it for him.
Yeah.
So, he did the right thing going to law school.
Sure. He needed to get something.
Which, by the way, I would still really like to know about.
About?
Who paid off those debts?
Like? Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Well, yeah, I do see people bring that up every day, in addition to every day being the right day to release Trump's taxes.
Right.
It's, or to arrest.
The right day to find out what. Hopefully, hopefully it means Susan Collins is gone.
Yes. We hope
hopefully it also means that we are able to do something about the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I wrote about this morning because
I see it.
Trump is feeling rather obsessive about the Supreme Court right now.
Sure.
That they're picking on him and that they don't like him. And he wants a new nominee. He thinks a new Supreme Court nominee is going to be the key to winning back, get this, women and or older voters.
I see.
He thinks if he puts a conservative woman on the court, then he gets all of the moderate women back.
Yes. That's usually the way it works with women.
Yes.
Just look at Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
That did the trick.
And he thinks that if he puts on a younger conservative, then he'll bring back older conservative voters.
Sure. Because younger,
but
older.
The problem is, that's Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito, because Ginsburg and Breyer are going to hang on as long as they can possibly hang on.
Right.
Not letting Trump have their seats.
Yeah.
So, unless nature intervenes,
right,
he's not going to get his vacancy.
True.
Before November.
I hope not. And nature could intervene and remove him. That could still happen.
That could still happen.
And then, but I don't know what Mike Pence will do
with
it.
Yeah, I have a really hard time seeing either Thomas or Alito falling for McConnell and Graham's scheme to kick out older conservatives in place of younger conservatives. I don't think they're going to want to do that.
Unless they can deep fake a P tape on one of them. That's a possibility. Get to work on that one. That'll never work with Thomas, right?
Seeing the Senate Republicans wanting to have a Supreme Court fight this summer,
maybe,
and fall before the election. After the whole Merrick Garland thing, I think there are too many vulnerable Republican senators around this time.
Could be.
To really feel excited about doing that.
Yeah,
I might be wrong.
Could be. You never know. They are willing to do some stupid things, or they think things will work that won't, like naming a woman to the Supreme Court will bring back all the women. And of course, they like to name young judges to the court. So basically, going into the election with Trump on the prowl for young women is probably not a great idea also. I don't know that he would put it that way, but you never know.
We can.
That's right. And so all a lousy position for him to be in. And of course, standing for re-election with tacit approval for bounties on the heads of American troops, probably bad. I think we've never done this before, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't have any data.
Why have we had a pandemic, killing?
Right.
By November, hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, that too. That's another issue that we still haven't dealt with. Well, it's been, like we said at the start of the show, it's been a rough June, really.
Yes, it has. And I saw a story just now. And Mark has written it up. The CDC surrenders. COVID-19 spreading too rapidly to be brought under control. The CDC is basically cried uncle.
Okay.
With coronavirus, saying that it's just, there's way too much virus, is the quote directly from the CDC, for it to be controlled now.
Oh dear.
It's like it's spreading too rapidly and too broadly.
Yeah. That doesn't surprise me.
We can't get it under control like other countries have done so, because we're us and we don't do that, and it's too late.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the assessment. I know the last couple of days I've been kind of watching the Republican governors doing their own version of surrendering, saying, all right, we're going to have masking requirements, or we're going to close this or that, or delay the opening of this or that. And I mean, we're past masks at this point. Everyone should wear them. It'll only get worse if you don't. But I don't think wearing masks
it's not going to save us at this point.
No, and we're bad at it. And we find out that with every even hint from a governmental source that something new might be safe, people just go hog wild and can't stop themselves from overdoing it. And I read early on in the show from Seattle, the area that one of the early hotspots, that the contact tracers were finding out that like 20%, 1 in 5 people who were positive were even bothering to self-isolate.
People who had symptoms.
Yeah.
I saw that story.
I don't know what this is just yet, so I'll just go out a little more. Don't. It says so on the sign on the door, every door that you want to enter. If you have the symptom, don't come in here. I think I will, though, actually go in there. All right, well, so much for the masking. That's not going to work either, because I just think I won't wear that. Or I'll wear it under my nose, or who knows.
Across my eyes.
Yes, you saw that one.
I saw that one.
All right, that was a good one.
It was a perfect metaphor for the Trump administration.
Yes. All right. Well, yeah, don't wear them over your eyes. That doesn't help either. And by the way, all the people who say the masks, they trap all the germs. Yeah, well, the inside of it will trap all your germs, true. Then don't put it across your eyes either, because that's just another entry point for you. But what can I say? It's about as bad as using someone else's tissues at this point. Okay. Don't do that either. And what else is news here? Let's see.
So, meanwhile, McConnell's still saying, yeah, maybe we don't have to do anything. We probably don't have anything to, do here. We'll think about it in July, which he's been saying since April.
That's interesting.
Tomorrow's July. He's still saying,
That's...
we just need to evaluate what we're doing. We can't have partisan wish lists.
He said something positive about masks at one point.
He did say something positive about masks,
he's
but
elderly,
he's still drawing his line in the sand for coronavirus relief.
Yeah.
Any further money has to come with no liability. Strong legal protections for schools, colleges, nonprofits, and employers that are putting their necks on the line to reopen. Well, hey, how about instead of them putting their necks on the line and putting their employees and customers in danger, we just don't reopen and we give them money to stay at home?
That would work. All the money that would otherwise change hands in the suits about whether or not the protection from liability should stand could simply be used to pay people to eat.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
You could subsidize payrolls, so nobody's business had to go under.
They were right. They were so close to an answer at one point.
You could put a lot of money into broadband, so going to school from home wouldn't be quite so difficult.
Yeah, that would be helpful. That might have been something we could have done with the lockdown time, too. They could have put those
It's just
cables
incredibly frustrating that the response to this has been so anemic thus far from Congress. And I understand the obstacle that is Mitch McConnell, but the Democrats haven't been out there raising holy hell every day. That they didn't learn from the last Great Recession, that what you have to do is spend really, really huge at the outset.
Yeah, I don't know.
I remain really frustrated and really upset. And
You're right. It's interesting too. I was just sort of caught by surprise by just listening to you say that McConnell says, well, maybe we'll wait until July to do anything, because traditionally July is spent saying we can't do anything because August is coming.
Right.
And we're going to leave. And I assume that they'll take a very lengthy recess based just on the COVID-19 situation. The last time they recessed, they didn't come anywhere near for months.
They'll be out for a while. What he's doing is more brinksmanship, because there are a lot of relief measures that were passed back in March that expire at the end of July. So he's thinking, force it all the way up to the end, get them panicky, get them really wanting to get this stuff renewed, and then they'll give in to me on liability.
All right. It's a strategy. Add a fiscal cliff.
That's how McConnell plays.
Yeah. Well, it's a strategy. It's not a bad one. I mean, in terms of getting your way, it's a bad one for like surviving the crisis. But other than that, Yeah, so that's what he's holding out for, is liability protections for whatever industries he picks, and no one else.
I know that he's talking about education most because that's the most palpable. That's the one that palatable, I should say. The one that people say, well, yeah, schools should be safe. Schools should be protected. What he's really talking about are businesses.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's the Chamber of Commerce that's controlling this.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, basically, so protection if we open our business and we don't bother enforcing any of the rules and you get sick here, you can't sue us.
Either as an employee or as a customer.
Oh, right, yes.
If we force our people to come back, if we say you don't get unemployment, you're going to be fired if you refuse to come back.
Yeah.
And you get sick, well, that's your problem.
Seems like a good way to get people sick, bad way to help them survive the pandemic. But okay, whatever. We can only have to put up with it for so much longer, presumably. But boy, it's getting to where I really can't. I can't even stomach the idea of just winning back the Senate. I mean, I want my 67, man. I want people cleared out. We're not going to get there at this stage, but well, hopefully lightning strikes and we're rid of him, or his patio strikes and we're rid of him. Whatever it takes.
An asteroid, a sinkhole,
right? Yeah, it's a very, very small asteroid. Because, there's still some innocent
coronavirus-size asteroid.
That's right. That would be like microscopic, and it's already here.
Yeah.
That's why I figured that was maybe why he suddenly became a mask advocate, was he realized, I'm fragile.
Yeah.
I should watch out.
He is.
Well.
He's not a kid. He's had polio. He can't have a completely healthy immune system.
I guess not. He's had polio. I didn't even realize that was the case. Or maybe you've mentioned it before and I put it out of my head. But so a little bit of experience with pandemics. I thought he would maybe be a better advocate, but
you'd think.
Guess not. It's important to him to get this stuff done. A lot of talk recently, though. I'm happy to see major campaign issue for advocates, at least on Twitter, just reminding everybody, yes, if you recapture the Senate and White House and hold on to the House, might be a good time to say, to hell with everything. We're getting rid of the filibuster, and all that worrying and all that time you guys spent worrying about us cramming stuff down your throat. Here it comes.
Yeah.
Not time to be stymied. We have a lot of garbage to recover from. You really, really screwed things up terribly. And once again, it's our job to clean it up. And we're not going to dance with you this time. We're going to steamroller you. So that would be kind of fun to see happen.
And while we're at it, maybe we're going to pack some courts.
Yeah. Expand them, pack them, redefine them, however, slice and dice them any way you like. There's a lot of precedent for that as well. You don't even have to.
Lots of precedents for expanding them. They haven't been expanded in quite a while.
Yeah. They are.
And the population's only growing. And yeah, some of the courts have huge backlogs even though they don't have vacancies. So yeah, maybe a handful of new judges on some of these courts is a good idea. An extremely good idea.
Right. So that's definitely in the cards out there as well. So yeah, of course, like I say, I'd love to have my 67 senators so that I could create some vacancies on those courts. If I didn't want to expand them, I'd just say there's a couple of mistakes that were forced on us in the last few years. And before these
like
guys...
Like the guy who lied to us in his Supreme Court hearings.
Yeah, right. We could do something about that instead of just throwing our hands up. Or the people who aren't, have only been lawyers for 10 minutes and are now federal judges or things like that we could take care of. Well, that would be some good stuff. All right.
We have our 67, and even if we had our 67, they would include Chris Coons and Joe Manchin. So...
Yes, although they are talking filibuster. That's
Kirsten.
Yeah, which one is she? I can't remember.
All of those people with that name should just decide on one and the one spelling.
And get together on that.
A lot easier.
Right. Well, she's a bit of an iconoclast, and she's never really going to be on anybody's same page there. But okay, we'll figure it out.
What it means when we get the Senate back, we're going to have to raise holy hell with them.
All right, well, we should be pushing them on it. I've even seen Manchin and Kuhn's name mentioned in the positive consideration of changing filibuster rules lists of the past couple of days. I don't know how strong they've been about it.
But I'll have to look for it. If you see it again, send it my way.
Okay, maybe I made it up. We'll find out. by next Tuesday, I'll have an answer for you.
You don't make things up.
We have to go. The time is running short. Yeah, I try not to try and back everything up. I will find that stuff and share it with you because it probably deserves some attention if we haven't discussed it. And if he did say it, we want to hold him to it, and that can be our job.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Thank you.
Happy 4th of July.
Hey, thanks. You too. Enjoy it. Let's assume we come out of this with a country on the other side and try again next Tuesday. We'll take it week by week.
All right.
Thanks so much. Take care, Joan. And we will wrap things up here and hand it over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's just jump right in and see if we can't read up through his summary right now. Getting close anyway. Nothing says Vichy collaborators, he says, better than all the GOP representatives boycotting House intelligence briefings on Russian bounties. How about that? They're going to stay away from that and hear no evil on that front. Amazing.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, a little bit more here. Federalist Society 3-judge panel appeals court panel ruled the GOP can restrict the vote to their heart's content. A little bit of information more about going on in Google as well, plus this note that we missed. Interpol rejected an Iranian arrest warrant for Donald Trump. Bad choice.